Good evening, and welcome to the St. Petersburg by Night podcasting network. Tonight, we present to you our behind-the-scenes show, After Dark.
Good evening and welcome to the St. Pete by Night Twitch channel where we play St. Petersburg by Night, a massive multiplayer 5th edition World of Darkness chronicle set in the city of St. Petersburg, Florida. My name is Kent, also known as Michikent on all social media. I am the lead storyteller of St. Pete by Night, but it's Saturday night, and you know what that means. It's time for After Dark, which is our behind the scenes program where we talk to players of the game, we talk to storytellers of the game, we talk to movers and shakers in the world of darkness. And tonight we have a very, very special guest on After Dark. Our guest is Gregory Maus, professional storyteller, and I say that with the utmost respect and regard. Gregory is a storyteller over on Start Playing, where you can sign up to play in World of Darkness Chronicles, set in the 20th anniversary system, which for a lot of the people in the St. Pete community might sound unfamiliar or a system they haven't tried yet. I like to call it World of Darkness Advanced, but we're going to get into that. We're going to explain what I mean by that, and we're going to have a nice little conversation about the differences between 20th anniversary and 5th edition, as well as Gregory's experience with the World of Darkness and with running games professionally. But for now, Gregory, say hi and introduce yourself, if you please.
So I'm Gregory Maus. Don't worry, I used to have a mouse on my business cards just to confuse people. So I have been, playing games for about 20 years now, starting with what was then called New World of Darkness and is now called Chronicles of Darkness, and then moved into 20th Anniversary Edition, and then have been professionally game mastering on Start.Playing for 2 years now.
Well, that's a fantastic introduction because that leads me into my first question, which was, how did you get exposed to World of Darkness or Chronicles of Darkness, and did you have any preconceived notions about the game getting into it? Because I know it had a bit of a reputation, especially in its heyday in the 90s, and then it kind of was a niche game or dropped under the radar for a while. So when did you first hear about it? Did you have any preconceived notions about it? And how did you get into it?
Well, classic. I started off in college, and I don't recall how I first heard about it. I think that I'd been familiar with third edition D&D and played that for a bit, but then was interested in something a bit more in depth, a bit more modern, and that sort of thing. And then I bought the book. I probably have it around here somewhere if anyone's curious to see what it looks like. fantastic cover, if you ask me. Oh, no, I can't see it. I could rummage for it, but that would not be a good view for anyone. And then, started running games for people, did a bit of Vampire the Requiem, as it was called, and then some of the Mage. Was that Mage?
I
That was
think it was
Mage the
Awakening.
Awakening.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Then some of the Changeling the Lost, and a few of the other ones, and had a good time. And honestly, it's not that interesting or special of a story. Just had a fun time with friends. The classic tabletop game experience.
As it should be. As it should be. I mean, I think before, the times of Critical Role, before people started viewing it as a business, it really was a hobby. It was really just something that we could enjoy with our friends or with our close community. And while I'm not opposed to the fact that it's become more popular and more widespread, I do think that that's what it comes down to, is that you should just be having fun with your friends, and that's where the base of it should lie. And I'm glad that that's still something that's held near and dear. So your first exposure to it Chronicles of Darkness
Yeah, it
specifically?
was Chronicles of Darkness, and I was actually initially the old World of Darkness, or as Boo now call it, just the standard World of Darkness, sounded stuffy to me, and it sounded just bogged down by so much lore and just really boring. But then, when I went to get my second master's degree, some new friends introduced me to it, so that I started playing campaigns at that and got really invested in all the lore and the considerations for this and that. Honestly, I feel like in many ways, Chronicles of Darkness actually has a lot of mechanical things that I prefer about it, but there's a lot more options in the main World of Darkness. The
Right.
20th anniversary edition, at least. Fifth
Yeah.
edition is a different story.
Well, and let's just jump into that, because I have so much that I'm curious to ask about when it comes to why you chose 20th anniversary versus 5th edition, and what kind of was your thoughts in regards to the two systems, because I know 20th, had a lot more material starting out, and it referenced all the old material, so it did have a pretty big catalog to draw from, which until the most recent couple of years, Vampire, or at least 5th edition, had very little. Like, it had very, very little material. So what was it about 20th anniversary that really spoke to you and drew you in, and was making it your system of choice?
Well, I really, again, the backlog of things that you can do with, and it's much more compatible with the earlier editions. And so you can draw from those other things much more effectively. I also find that it gives a much wider variety of story possibilities than fifth edition. Fifth edition seems very much geared towards providing a particular story of personal horror and the resisting or descent into becoming a monster. And while that's fine, that is an okay story on its own, it seems very limiting. There's no
Okay.
discussion, it seems to me, of dealing with the larger social issues. And I suspect that that's largely because of when fifth edition was first launching, they delved with there was the Chechnya or the issue with the earlier playtests, which involved atrocities against homosexuals in Chechnya.
Yeah.
That was poorly received, and I suspect the lesson that fifth edition's management drew from that was, we will never touch anything even vaguely controversial again, because the internet will be mean to us.
I do see, since then, that World of Darkness is starting to delve into new thematic elements. With the Bloodstained Love book that came out, with Werewolf's introduction, I found that they are starting to take on some of those things, but they are doing so with a very velvet glove, soft touch. Like, they are not encouraging it as much as the older material did. So I agree with you there that it is all about, like, your personal horror story and your descent into staving off the dark fate that you have laid out before you. But yeah, and also in 20th anniversary, most of the books are released. Most of the material is out there. You've got your mage, you've got changeling, you've got werewolf, vampire. all of these, which obviously 5th edition is still playing catch up on. We've got Vampire, we've got Hunter, and we've got Werewolf, which they're good. But people are still asking for Mage. People are still asking for Changeling, Wraith, and 20th
I don't know how they're
anniversary
going to
has.
manage Mage in 5th edition, given how streamlined everything is. I
I
don't
don't
know if
either.
that's possible. I'm running a Mage game right now, and the inherent flexibility of it is its greatest strength, and something that seems impossible to translate into the ease of introduction that they're going for.
Right. Right.
That I absolutely love how it forces the players to consider how their characters view the universe, how they view the fundamental nature of reality, and how they then manipulate it, and how they do so in such a way that is still consistent with how other people view reality.
Right.
That is a beautiful meat to a game, which I don't think has ever been done elsewhere since. And I've looked at a lot of different systems, and I don't think anyone has accomplished that. To be fair, on the other hand, many Mage game or players are pretentious as hell, and the game is hard to grasp. But
And they
once
can
you
get really
finally,
crunchy with it too. They could get
it
very,
can.
very crunchy. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. But I don't think any other game has quite the same depth of weird philosophical engagement just right off the bat.
Well, I found that to be the case with the World of Darkness as a whole. I've never seen, and I have a limited view. I haven't played every game under the sun, but I can say that, like, in the games that I have experienced, I've never seen such a well developed game with a rich history, a lot of lore, a lot of depth, a lot of personal challenges. I mean, Call of Cthulhu is another game that I would give a lot of
Hmm.
credit to and credence to, but for it to have given you such a well fleshed out world that the World of Darkness has is a testament to it. And they still
Oh,
encourage you to do your own thing, create your own thing, but they have created a really really rich tapestry that you can draw from and play with and put into effect. Also, the fact that it's based in the real world. Most role
mhm.
playing games have some sort of fictional detachment, whereas the World of Darkness is like, hey, this is the world we live in now, or in the past, in the case of some of your games. But like for the most part, it's tangible stuff based in reality, even if it takes it into supernatural, surreal
Mhm.
elements. That is something that I really do give it credence and credit to, and I have not seen duplicated anywhere
Oh, absolutely.
since.
I don't think any other tabletop RPG has like a what is it, 1,000 books total in the World of Darkness Live?
And growing, and growing.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
something like
absolutely.
that. Yeah, I mean, maybe Dungeons and Dragons Third Edition had
They
that,
had a
but
lot of
that,
books.
yeah, but that isn't as geared to the real world. It's not tied inherently to the place where we live and all of the ramifications of that.
Right. Well, and a lot of the Dungeons and Dragons books are separate settings and all of the additional stuff that comes with that. So the series of
That's true.
Eberron books, the series of Forgotten Realms books, everything like that. Whereas
Yeah,
all of the World of Darkness books are all set in the same setting, maybe different time periods throughout that setting, but the
right.
same setting.
And
So
how exactly it all fits together definitely requires some game master adjudication
yeah,
because
yeah.
otherwise there are way too many people ruling the world at any given time.
Oh, for sure. And I've always said that if you wanted to get they could have a doctorate degree for World of Darkness lore alone, for you
Oh,
to know
absolutely.
everything about every setting and how they intertwine and when they intertwine. Like it's so much information. So with 5th edition, it really does seem like they did try to simplify and streamline all of that to some benefit because they're bringing in a new crowd, a new fan base, so they don't want to overwhelm
Absolutely.
them. But
It's a
also to their
fantastic, yeah.
yeah,
It's a fantastic off ramp for people who are coming from 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons because it inherently codifies this is who your person is, this is the connections that they have in the world, this is what they care about. And for people who are coming in from systems where that's not relevant, like the more combat focused Dungeons and Dragons, where most people are coming in from, that is an important thing to realize that
mm,
who you are matters. You are more than just a stat block
yeah,
or but I think that it's it's training wheels.
It is training
Not to
wheels.
be too diet about it, but it's training wheels, which helps people figure out the basics of role playing. And I find that a lot of people then move on from that. I mean, my players, who is inherently a biased sample, move on from 5th edition to 20th anniversary edition and find it much more rewarding because there's so much more you can do. And a lot of my players who have like started in 20th anniversary edition or earlier and have tried 5th edition have found it deeply unsatisfying. Werewolf in particular, I think, really sanded off all of the edges and tried to make it so much more palatable to everyone,
Oh, for
but
sure. For
in
sure. And
ways that are,
Vampire too. I mean, all
yeah,
of them. All of them have done that to a certain degree. And
but in ways which are still wildly insensitive. Like in Vampire, they basically said, yeah, all the Sabbats and all the really ones that you don't want to have to deal with that are problematic, yeah, they all go to the Middle East, which is to say they don't exist because nothing exists
right,
in the Middle
nothing
East.
exists in the Middle
No one would
East.
want to play a game in the Middle East, right? I
Right.
mean, they're just, like sand and nothing of importance. Just it's gross Eurocentrism.
Well, and for those of us who did come from the older editions, who are used to being given answers to questions, being given a bevy of lore and materials to draw from to tell those stories, we're getting not that. We're not getting definitive answers. We're not getting explanations of this stuff. We're kind of getting very generic and kind of vague terms, which, and you and I were talking about this before we went live, every storyteller, especially experienced ones, or game master, or dungeon master, or player, understands that you can do whatever you want with the rule set. It says it in every rule book of storytelling and World of Darkness, Dungeons and Dragons, especially now. These are supposed to be guidelines. Use them if you want to, as long as you're having fun. Who cares? We all know this. But one of the things that I loved about World of Darkness, and still do to a certain degree, is they'll still tell you what their interpretation is. They would tell you what they think the answer is, and then let you make up your own decisions based off of that. We're
Mm-hmm.
not getting so much of that now, and I wonder if it is because they are trying to tailor to a wider audience, that they're trying not to upset the purists, but they're also trying not to overwhelm new players, or if they're just not sure which direction to take it into. Like
Perhaps they're just listening to the reaction and tailoring it precisely to make it seem as unproblematic as possible.
right,
But
right,
that's
and
my hyper cynical take. But then again, I'm a pretty cynical guy.
well, an old World of Darkness ended to such vitriol. The way that the Gehenna book was received, the way that the wrapping up was received, the way Chronicles of Darkness, which at the time was called World of Darkness,
New
but was a
World of Darkness,
completely
not like that
revamping,
old World of Darkness.
it got a lot of hatred, especially from people who were so into the original World of Darkness at the time. So I
I mean, that's
wonder if
fine.
there's also some apprehension about that as well, about stirring all that up again. But whatever the case may be, I do think it is a step in the wrong direction. I'd like to see them clear that stuff up. They have the Gehenna War book coming out soon, so I'm hoping they'll answer some questions. But
Yeah. But I mean, the thing is, even if they don't answer things, it would be nice for them to come out and say, this is something we are not going to have a canonical answer on. The game masters, the storytellers, or can say whatever they want, and it is true for your individual game. Whereas if they don't state anything and are waiting for later, it feels like it inherently invalidates what the storyteller has already established.
right, right. So one of the things that you said is that you found a lot of people who are coming from 20th anniversary having a difficult time enjoying 5th edition because they felt like it was more limiting, or that it didn't give as many possibilities. That's kind of why I consider 20th anniversary to be World of Darkness Advanced, because I feel like you can go the opposite way. You can go from 5th edition to 20th anniversary if you want to take
Mm-hmm.
on more mechanics, or if you want to make a more, in-depth, intense game. You can go that direction, but I could totally see how it wouldn't work the opposite way. How it would feel, unless you were looking for a simpler game, or if you were looking for more streamlined mechanics, I could see going the opposite direction. But it does make sense that 5th edition could be a great springboard into older editions or into 20th anniversary. because of that. So one of the big conversations that comes up a lot, and you said you were introduced through Chronicles of Darkness,
Mhm.
but I know that I could never get into it. I could never get into it because of how it was presented to me.
Mhm.
What do you think about that whole debate between Chronicles of Darkness and World of Darkness, old, new, whatever the case may be? What's your take on all of that?
So I think is that the designers of Chronicles of Darkness drew a lot of lessons from the reaction to a lot of the feedback they got from the original World of Darkness. Chiefly would be is that power scaling is wild.
Mm-hmm.
So they made things a bit more flat, a bit more balanced. They also made it so that the different splats could interact on a much more even footing.
Right.
They also streamlined a lot of the now, streamlined isn't the right word. Refined a lot of the mechanics. So, for example, willpower is wildly unbalanced in 20th Anniversary Edition, particularly
Mm-hmm.
for vampires. If you are not playing with like or 9 or 10 willpower on your vampire, you're going to get dominated by somebody, and that's a massive problem. So,
Right.
how they fixed that by tying it into other things, I think worked a lot. It's what is it? They called it blood potency in Chronicles of Darkness instead of generation, and
Which they took
that
into fifth too. Yeah.
yeah, and I can see mechanically why that is an improvement because it makes things a lot more balanced and it doesn't create the same sort of intense hierarchies that I could understand a lot of players not being happy with in classic World of Darkness. But as I actually played classic World of Darkness and Vampires, that sort of hierarchy and how you interact with that hierarchy creates a lot of depth. And it
Mm-hmm.
has a lot of analogies to the real world of how do you deal with people who are more powerful, who hold strings to you with which they can control you, who can just do things that are impossible for you.
Well, in Vampire the Masquerade, especially, the I feel like there's an understanding that we're all pawns of the elders. We're all
Mm-hmm.
pawns of the Methuselahs or the antediluvians or whatever the case is. And I think that does add a really interesting element. And one thing that, again, I will credit fifth edition with is that they are trying to tell the story of the old ways going away and the new trying to inherit the earth and all this other kind of stuff. It's an interesting take. What I
Mm-hmm.
wish they would do is just flesh it out a little bit more and be more honest of like, hey, this is why the old are going away. This is the explanation as to what situation the new are inheriting. But
Mm-hmm.
I think that's an interesting direction to take it. I do
Yeah.
enjoy the concept of the blood thinning, that disciplines aren't defined by clan anymore. I just wish they would give some real meta story explanation for it,
Yeah.
instead of just leaving it up to our imaginations, which is fine. We always had that ability, but it would be nice to hear what their intention behind it is.
Yeah.
Uh,
I mean, but going back to Chronicles of Darkness, I
yes,
think one
please.
place where they really shined was where they got away from the old World of Darkness stuff entirely. Like their take on Changeling was radically different and very interesting because the original Changeling is comparatively lighthearted. It's about the power of imagination, albeit tempered by growing up and losing that sense of imagination. Whereas Changeling the Lost is you are an escaped abductee who might not have a life to go back to and are fundamentally changed by that.
Well,
Similarly,
that's one of the
oh,
things that a lot of new World of Darkness people want is they really hope that they take from Changeling the Lost more than the Dreaming if they bring it back to fifth edition. A lot
yeah,
of people want to see the Lost more.
Changeling the Dreaming has a fantastic place, though. I don't think
Sure.
that it should be entirely lost. Like, I entirely removed all of the lore for a game that I ran and basically did a Studio Ghibli inspired Changeling game
Yeah.
set in Meiji era Japan, where you see all of the changes going on for steam engine being reduced or introduced, the centralization of the government and its moves to control the local religions and the interaction of that just created a fantastic atmosphere. When contrasted all of the fantastic with the mundanities of a little village life and, local politics, as well as the huge changes coming in from the outside world. So I don't know. I still have a soft spot for Changeling the Dreaming. I'm not going to say that one is inherently superior to
No.
the other, but they're very different. And both are worthwhile experiences.
Well, and I had a difficulty getting into Changeling back when old, Changeling the Dreaming, because it did feel like a departure from what World of Darkness had framed itself as. It had framed itself as this very dark, very gothic, very kind of, you know, alternative like setting view on the world, and then they bring in the dreaming and it feels like, wow, this is really fantastical and bright and colorful, and that's not what I in my goth days of high school was really into at the time. So it did feel like it was very jarring shift away from what they had already been presenting, and so with what they've framed now in the fifth edition, I feel like they could run into that issue again if they don't frame it correctly. So I agree with you. I don't think they should get rid of what people liked about the dreaming, but I think incorporating elements of the lost could be to their benefit.
Oh,
Uh
absolutely. You could deal, for example, the way that I can think of that you could do it on top of my head is you could say that the changelings who are like the true Fae that have come back from Arcadia are not actually the true Fae. The real true Fae are terrifyingly inhuman in ways that are incomprehensible, and they are coming to claim the existing changelings who have found their way back.
yeah, that would
So
be a
you
really
could
good take
combine
on
the
it.
two themes that way, and I think that could be fun.
That would be an excellent take on it. So I want to reference to something you mentioned. You mentioned a game set in Japan.
Hmm.
A lot of your games, you seem to take the historical approach. You don't
Hmm.
prefer to run more modernized games. You usually choose, a lot of distant locations and a lot of distant time periods. What is the motivation or the reasoning behind that? Why do you prefer to run like a Dark Ages campaign versus a Modern Knights campaign?
Well, for one, I'm a history nerd. I love researching weird aspects of history, and it gives a lot of perspective on the present. And so insights into how much people have changed and oftentimes how little they've changed. And building the world of darkness into that is, first of all, not something that's unique to me. That goes back all the way to first edition
Oh yeah.
World of Darkness.
Oh
So,
yeah.
as much as I would like to credit this as my brilliant innovation, no, that's really old one. So, it gives a huge variety of settings that just is not possible if you just imagine the modern day. And for Vampire in particular, it allows you to start in one year and then go decades. And so you can really get a look at how actions that seem minor at one point have massive long term rippling consequences. So, for example, the one game that we are currently wrapping up, it's been going for about a year or so now with a short hiatus, started in, let's see, 1180 AD in a small, predominantly Jewish village in northern Italy. The uh, player character was the sister of the Baron of the village. The Baron, who, like the rest of the family, was secretly Jewish, creating complications with having to hide their relationships because he wanted to continue the bloodline by marrying a Jewish woman, but also needed to marry someone who could provide stability to the village and ensure that their family continued to have its position. So, a mysterious woman shows up and offers to uh, help the sister provide a royal wife who would be happy to convert to Judaism and continue the bloodline. The player character agrees to this bargain. Hands are shook and things are written out in gold dust in ways which are totally not ominous. Turns out the bride was the mysterious woman who had made the bargain in the first place. She was, in fact, a fae. And so she marries this baron, and they then start creating a new family and altering the village such that everyone in the village is steadily being adopted into the changeling world into the Fey world and replaced with other children, slowly converting the entire village over the course of 50 years into what ends up being a fortress against rival Fey factions in an apocalyptic conflict that the player characters are now dealing with. That's the sort of thing that's only possible when you have decades to work with. And you can't do that in the modern day unless you're going into the future.
Well, and that's a wonderful thing about that 20th anniversary allows that 5th edition hasn't quite come around to. And I'm not sure it honestly will. And I understand why. Again, because the material already exists. If you want to play Dark Ages Vampire, you can. 20th anniversary has it. If you want to play Victorian Age, like the old editions have it. They seem to be primarily focused on the here and now and the future going forward. But I'm of the belief that if 5th edition wanted to capitalize on it, all they'd have to do is release a book of rule addendums that just says, hey, if you want to run this during a different time period, here's the adjustments you need to make. And there are some homebrew resources that exist or that creators have created, but it's not the same. I'd love to see
Absolutely
the company support this idea. Because you're right.
That just provides some translation rules. Like they've had translation guides from classic World of Darkness to New World of Darkness, as Chronicles of Darkness, where you could combine all of the really cool settings that they had dealt with. Like their take on Demon was amazing because it was about this whole concept of the God Machine as this massive collective entity built of all these different things, and that demons were basically rogues from the Matrix. And honestly, it sounds weird. It was awesome in my opinion because it had a lot of espionage tropes built into it, and they had translation guides so that you could have these two forces interact with each other.
Right.
You could have literal fallen angels confronting a machine god trying to keep the status quo, and you could similarly have rogues from the Matrix confronting God Almighty or fallen angels.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. And they could do something like that easily enough.
Exactly.
Is just create something that says like, okay, if you're running a Dark Ages game, here's some adjustments you make. If you're running a Victorian game, here's some adjustments you make.
The money is there to be made.
It's there to be made, but it doesn't seem, at least at present, I can't speak for what they're actually doing behind the scenes, but it doesn't seem like that is in their plan at the very least.
I mean, maybe they're thinking, oh, well, then players might play in the Victorian age and participate in colonialism, and that would be scary.
But
we can't have players actually confront any of the horrors of the past or consider the mindsets that went into it, because people might say mean things about us online.
Well, and that's unfortunate also, because again, one of the things that I loved about World of Darkness, and to be fair, they didn't always do it well or tactfully, but they did confront social issues. They did confront cultural difference. They did confront things like sexism, racism, like all these things. They incorporated that into the material, which a lot of other games have completely avoided for good reason, I'm sure. But they would confront the dark topics of the world, and again, you're right. It does feel like they are avoiding that as best as possible, and I understand why a misstep can be damning to your company or to yourself as a writer. But I think that that's a risk you have to take at some points if you want to keep what people loved about this going and you want to keep it active. You've got to bring in the right people, bring in the right assistants, the right cultural representatives to help flesh it out in a tasteful way, not just outright avoid it.
That article by J.F. Zambrano, which I shared with you earlier, really indicates that they are not interested in putting in the work to actually adapt that with any sort of nuance. Like their assumption was, well, there's this one faction of werewolves, a subgroup of which were Nazis. They're all Nazis now because we wouldn't want any risk of doing that. And then their initial impulse was to say, oh, there's 2 Native American tribes. Oh, we'll just kill one of them. That's too many.
Right. Right. Yeah, and it's a very clear cut,
It's
raise
clean
the
and
ground
tidy.
measure. Yeah, it
Mm-hmm.
is. It's very, and World of Darkness is anything but tidy. So transitioning a little bit, talking a little bit more about 20th anniversary. One of the issues I had with the older editions, and to be fair, I have not gotten into 20th again since, but I would like to, is that you really could not balance all the different settings very easily. You couldn't have a werewolf game interacting with a vampire game or a hunter game or anything else because they all had their own mechanics, they had their own systems. Their balance was way all over the place depending on which setting it was, which, to 5th edition's credit and to their detriment, because it has meant watering down a lot of all of the systems, but I feel like 5th edition does have a good balance. Like, we simultaneously run a hunter game, a werewolf game, and a vampire game all at once with the possibility of them interacting, because the rules allow for it. But in
Right.
20th, that's not the case. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about all that. And
I mean, if player characters interacting with the other splats are something that happens all the time in
right,
my games.
right,
And it's really interesting to see how each one considers the other to be cheating. So, for example, most of the different splats have no way of influencing human society at all to the extent that vampires do, because even the weakest vampire can blood bond someone.
right.
So, but most of them, if they get into a fist fight with a werewolf, lose
As they
horrifically.
should.
Right. So, I always find that that adds an interesting texture, and you can throw threats at each of them that they are less capable of dealing with, forcing them to innovate. Like, for example, my Mage Renaissance game, set mostly in Florence, though at the moment they're part of a diplomatic mission to Naples, is dealing with a lot of werewolves who are closely intertwined with the Catholic Church and also with alchemists and with the humanist movement arising in Italy at the time. And they are aware that they cannot go toe to toe with a werewolf because they will die. So instead, they have to be much more subtle. They have to maneuver around them, placate the ones who are currently at their throats, and make sure that they have other werewolf allies at their backs, while also bringing their mage abilities to the fore so that they have something a little extra to, you know, provide backup.
Right. I think that one of the things that I've seen people bring up, mostly in jest, but I think some people would be interested to see this, is effectively a Monster Squad game where
Mm-hmm.
you could have a vampire PC and a werewolf PC and a mage PC.
One
I
of my
don't
fellow
believe
PMs
that's.
runs that very well, actually. Like
Oh,
he's
oh
running
really?
his own take on like an apocalypse scenario, and apparently it's working out extremely well.
Really? Okay.
Because everyone brings their own unique talents to the fore and brings in all of their other things. As a professional game master, I would not want to do that
No.
because it gets too inherently messy. Like even I tried combine or allowing multiple different types of Farah in a Appalachia game that I ran. So there was one werewolf, one were crocodile, which could basically turn into a giant hydra, one were crow, and one were bear. So their initial issue, the Werecrow could go anywhere, which meant a lot of screen time was focused on the Werecrow. And so that meant it was not at all balanced as to the amount of play focus that anyone got during a different session. Similarly, there was no way anyone could, in a normal fight, go up against the Macaulay, the were crocodile
Right.
Hydra. Although, funnily enough, he was the one who ended up dying, because even if you are a giant, terrifying Hydra, silver musket balls are lethal.
They will
Because,
still, yep.
yeah, they ended up stirring the anger of a massive pack of Fianna who were, pushing west or against the Cherokee and the Uktena. I think the term for that in the modern edition is older brother.
I think that it is. I know they changed a bunch of the tribes.
Right. So the Cherokee affiliated
Right.
one. So they ended up stirring up a lot of Fianna against them, particularly, mocking the ones that they had killed, such that one of the rare crows got the name Deadmocker. Anyways, so they came prepared with an army with silver in their muskets, and were quite effective at killing that one player character. Then the West withdrew, and that was how we concluded that campaign, because they had ensured the unleashing of a massive, horrible monstrosity that had laid beneath Appalachia for hundreds of years.
So
But that's a different story.
here's an interesting question tying in the history and the love of history. How much preparation do you put into creating a chronicle or a campaign set in one of these time periods? Because I assume there's a lot of study that goes into it, combined with any pre-existing knowledge you have. How much leeway time do you give yourself before announcing a new chronicle to make sure that you have all the pieces in place that you want?
So generally, the players and I, as we are wrapping up a chronicle, are already discussing what we're planning to do next, which gives me a few weeks to start prepping and start doing the research, most of which I share with the players, so that they themselves can use that to build their own characters and flesh them out in new and interesting ways. And I do extensive research. I go to my local library and pick things up there, combining that with a lot of internet research. Wikipedia is a fantastic starting place. It has so much. And then from there, you go into the citations of where they're getting information, and then you spin out from there. But honestly, even during sessions, the players or I will come up with a question of, wait, does this exist here during this time period? Food or clothing comes up particularly often, or just terms or attitudes. And so we'll rush off for a quick search in the middle of sessions, and that can, adjust the entire tone of things.
Well, I have to give you a lot of credit too, because it must be just very intellectual and informative too to think about and research these different time periods, as well as passing it on to your players. Your players must have a very vast thirst for history and that kind of knowledge to be able to
Some much
participate
more
into
than
it.
others, I assure you.
Yeah.
Some of them are not interested in the slightest. They would prefer to get back to either their personal dramas or, murder.
Fair, fair.
But for the most part, they are generally quiet and respectful about it, and understand that other people are enjoying it.
And what made you decide to take this from just a hobby to a profession? What made you make the jump into professional storytelling? Because that is a bold move in a very saturated industry. But you have run over 300 sessions. Like, you've done so well. You've made your mark and obviously have a steady player base to work with that you can keep these chronicles just cycling through. What made you decide to take that leap?
I mean, it was relatively low risk. I just had to make a account on the site, write up potential campaigns, post them, and then attract players. It is a pretty comfortable side gig. It allows me to do other things during the day, and then just run 4 different games, one each night of the week.
That's that's just so cool though, because I think that a
Hmm.
lot of people are just I found a lot of people are terrified of the concept of storytelling at all, let alone trying to charge people for storytelling, which I think is a misconception we need to do away with, because people don't realize the amount of work that goes into storytelling and the amount of effort, and that it is a service that's being provided. And so I'm all for professional storytelling. I'm all for it, and I'm so glad that it's accessible now, which 20 years ago we would never have even imagined the
Mhm.
possibility of it. But with the gaming boom, I'm glad that that's become a possibility and that those opportunities are available. Uh, what goes into you deciding what splat to use or what setting to use for these games?
But generally, I talk it out with my players. I have a Discord community. I'll propose ideas, or other players will propose ideas, and then we work out what would fit best in that. It's, just a general ongoing discussion process.
Do you start by deciding a setting or do you just start by deciding a splat? Like, do you choose like a time period or a splat or both? Is it kind of like an intermixed conversation?
It could go either way. Although honestly, even if I choose a time period, I regularly have like a range of times because even in eras which to us today seem, all as one, to the people living it, 20 years is a big time, and a lot has changed since then. I mean, as you said, 20 years ago, online tabletop games would be impossible.
A
Now they
myth.
are common, if not the most common way to do it.
Yeah.
And so if you consider just how much can change, then you can really start. So, for example, in my Appalachia game, I wrote out the general bullet points as to what was going on in any particular era, the both in the mundane history as well as the supernatural world of darkness history, and then said these are the various implications, these are the events that we're likely to be dealing with, the themes, the sort of things that are available, and then the players and I will discuss that either in Discord beforehand or during session 0.
I know one of the things I've found most difficult is finding a reliable source for World of Darkness information. White Wolf Wiki is great, but it can be very contradictory and out of date. And,
Yes.
some articles could have very little information, others could have way too much or too diverse information. What are some of your go to resources that you call upon when you are doing your research? Are there certain sites that you prefer or certain books? You've mentioned the
Well,
library a couple of times. Like, what's your go to?
for World of Darkness stuff, the White Wolf Wiki is a good place to start, but I make sure to actually check the sources that they cite. And
Mm-hmm.
so I find those books and then I make sure to reference them. In general, though, the 20th anniversary edition books are pretty nice compendia of all of the different lore. They'll reference things and then occasionally I'll build off of there.
Yeah, I picked up the 20th anniversary Dark Age Vampire book. It's a lot thicker than the original Dark Age book. I was surprised when I got it in the mail just how big this book was. But
Yeah,
that's a benefit in my mind. Like, more information the better, and you're getting it all in one big chunky source book.
yeah. The
Uh
Mage 20th edition is 700 pages.
wow.
Yeah.
Of the splats, which would you think you have more of a leaning towards? What's your favorite of all of the splats so far, or at least top
Oh.
two or three if you had to pick? Because I know everybody has their go to. I'd be very curious to see what yours is.
So, that is tricky. I think that I do like the inherent depth of Mage and
Okay.
how it allows for more freeform uh, abilities, as long as you can negotiate with the GM that you're actually capable of that. And of course, the possibility that your magic will go horrifically wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. And the reality bending and time changing and everything that's possible. There are a vast amount of possibilities with Mage that you don't see in most of the other settings. I think Werewolf can touch on it a little bit with limitations. Wraith can touch on it a little bit. Changeling definitely.
Hmm.
But Vampire is pretty stuck in like the world as we know it. The Tremere dabble, but they
Yeah.
don't even come close to the breadth and width of possibilities that Mage does.
Yeah, but
So
that makes perfect sense for vampires. Vampires are
right,
inherently more static creatures. They think in terms of rigidity, in terms of flesh, in terms of uh, blood. They're thinking in terms of the immediately visceral. So
yeah,
thematically, that works perfectly. But I like the flexibility of Mage
for sure.
and how it has such an incredible variety of games that you could run. Just about anything is possible in it.
I want to give a shout out, by the way, to Stolen Grace, a new follower here who mentioned that Ghost Council is the 5th edition name for the Uktena. So thank you so much for mentioning that. I was
Ghost
racking my
Council.
brain trying to remember which one it was.
Interesting. So is that a reference to the ghost dance movement that took place during the 19th century, I guess?
It's more, I think it's more of a reference into like the more spiritual ghost, like after death side. I don't know if it's
But
rooted in anything
aren't the
specifically.
Silent Striders still the ones dealing with wraiths?
Silent Striders are now kind of more like emissaries, messengers. They bring in a lot of Ravnos qualities in the fact that they're kind of nomadic and always on the move. They don't
But they already
really.
had that.
They changed a lot. Now, to their credit, to 5th edition's credit, they did say this was going to be a restart of the entire canon, which fine, but
That
also
definitely seems necessary considering the dramatic changes that they've made.
right, but also now it contradicts some of the things they'd already placed in Chicago by Night and some of the lore that they draw upon. So it's kind of a rebrand, kind of a restart. It's still a little muddled.
It's like the new canon for Star Wars,
right,
where
right.
they will draw things arbitrarily in ways that are probably contradictory here and there.
We'll decide as we go. Yeah, for sure. So you get into Start Playing. What made you choose Start Playing as the service you wanted to work with? Because I know there have been a few others that have sprouted up over time, but Start Playing is the go-to. What was it about working with them that made you decide to make that kind of your home base and hub for professional storytelling?
I mean, primarily it's the largest, which inherently creates a network effect. There's the most players on it. It's the same reason that people are still on Facebook, despite Facebook being terrible, because all their friends and family are on it.
Yeah, and so many things are connected to it in some
Which
fashion or
is
another.
an unfair comparison to Start.play. It's a fine site. They're doing a lot of work to keep the user interface up to date. Their customer service, from everything I've seen, is pretty good. It's honestly just pretty well done, and the cuts on it are pretty generous. They only take 10% of each of the sessions, which is even better than a lot of the like professional tutoring sites that I've worked with before. Like those will take up to 25% and have terrible conditions in general. 10% is pretty good.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's not a bad take at all. And you're right. It is the go-to most trafficked location. With the games that you run, do you usually take a specific group and just say, okay, this is my group moving forward, and we're going to stick with this group until the story is done? Or will you interchange players based off of availability or, on a session by session basis? What's your model for running games there?
That generally it's the same players each week for that night of the week. Sometimes players are going to be unavailable, in which case they have to skip the session here or there. Other times, people's schedules will change permanently and they just will not be able to make it to the session.
It's the bane of TTRPGs, scheduling.
So for my Friday game, one of my players is not sure whether he's going to be able to make it to the campaign. He'll tell me in the next few weeks, depending on how things shake out. So potential slot available in case people are interested on Fridays. Looks like it's going to be classic Viking Age vampires.
That's amazing. That's absolutely amazing.
I'm really excited.
So many possibilities with that as well, and I think that's so interesting. And even just looking at the games on your front page, you've got a noir style Naga game. You've got Were Sharks of the Caribbean. Like, you are tackling some very interesting and unique and outstanding possibilities. What's the strangest story idea you've come up with? Like, what's the most unusual time period or most unusual splat/time period combination? Like, what would you say is the most out of left field you've come up with?
So the weirdest of the games that I've actually run would be vampires recruited by Hugh Hefner to raid a Nazi base underneath the Atlantic Ocean at the very end of World War II to find out what the Semizi down there were working on.
Okay, that's That's a lot. That's several
Yeah.
different. We could dissect that piece by piece, but as an overall model, that is attention grabbing, to
It was a
say the
good
very
time. It was
least.
called Into the Midnight Zone because, of course, that's an actual level of the ocean. And it was initially inspired by the thought that vampires could be awake indefinitely beneath the ocean.
For sure. Yeah.
And so we started out with a discussion of okay, suppose the Sabbat, for example, built a colony beneath the ocean for research purposes and then investigating what went on there. But then that eventually adapted to, killing Nazis because who doesn't love killing Nazis?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. What's the most modern story that you've told? Closest
Right.
to our current time period.
So
What
there
would you
are
say?
two separate games that I've run in the 1980s, one of
Okay.
which was a movie.
A movie. Okay.
Yes. Okay. So let me start with the first one because the first one was more standard. It was 1980s San Francisco called Tainted Blood. So it was after the rise of the AIDS pandemic, which creates a bit of a stir amongst vampires because it's a huge masquerade breach if vampires are spreading AIDS around
Right.
and that's then tracked back to them. So there was all sorts of intrigue with the Camarilla, which previously had a good relationship with the Anarchs there. So the Camarilla then started having to crack down and do blood tests on vampires who attended Elysium, which was controversial to say the least.
Right.
And one blood test, which the players never actually found this out, but was a false blood test, basically brought everything to a boil, particularly when the player characters accidentally then set off a war with the Setites. They have Setites in 5th edition.
They have the ministry, but they still do
Okay.
have elements of Setites in there. Yeah.
Yeah, so they kicked off a war with the Setites, and then factions of the Anarchs were jumping in on that, as well as the Sabbat. It was going to be a massive war, which ended up wiping, or was going to overthrow a lot of San Francisco. But then several of the player characters died, and we were amused, or more amused at the possibilities of what was going to occur. And then we switched into fighting Nazis under the ocean.
that's, that's an incredible leap, but it seems like your players are just in for that. Like they're excited to take these fantastical jumps and differences in setting.
It's a fantastic group. Like 9 times out of 10, well, no, about half of the players who come in will be in for a while, and then they'll either decide that it's not for them or their schedules are less stable than I have. But the ones who stick with me are fantastic players who are totally invested and really love, learning about things and working together and making great characters. My players are great, is what I'm saying.
What's one of the most outrageous character concepts you've received? Like even made you with your fantastical ideas kind of wonder
Ooh.
or think about or had to tool with to make work in some capacity.
I think that might actually be in the mage or in the 80s game that's I was going to mention, which was the movie.
Yeah.
So the concept was that it was a 1980s schlocky kung fu movie with classic sort of like black exploitation, femsploitation, and it was supposed to be low budget and just generally terrible. And it was beautiful. So one of the concepts was someone who was a mannequin who was brought to life using golem magic to protect the local Jewish community in Brooklyn.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, it was fun. It worked really well because Mage 20th Anniversary Edition is really flexible, so we could do that without fundamentally altering the rules at all. And it was a short campaign, so there weren't any long-term issues with that. So they ended up. The idea was that they would be fighting against the one who killed their sensei, of course, because classic cliched plot line and fighting through a series of people who are trying to murder them, mafia construction site people, uh, corrupt cops, of course, and then they were going to build their way up to fight the evil executive at the end who dual wielded a rapier in one hand and a machine gun in the other, doing, a complicated fencing technique. Just ridiculous and wild and over the top. But another fun element of that is that in Mage 20th Anniversary Edition, mages can go crazy if their magic goes wild or goes some interesting ways. The particular way that we interpreted in this case was that the actor of the character just sort of gave up on the project and just was phoning everything in the rest. So just did not care at all. And it was after they were doing, so one of the elements of magic that we incorporated into it was product placement, that you could say, I'm going to patch myself up with these Band-Aid brand bandages. And so that's what she was doing, but she botched on the roll. And so then the player just narrated the character saying, do you guys ever feel like why are we doing this?
What's the point
and then
of all
hard
this?
cut, because that's where the end of the movie. And so then later on, the character just sort of lightly taps at a glass door, and then it shatters dramatically because the implication is the actor just did not care at all. But so anyways, they ended up all dying horrifically because they didn't coordinate well in the fight. But it was a fantastic tale of the tragedy and triumph of capitalism and corporatization of the neighborhood, etc. But I wanted to get in the dual-wielding mage executive guy, in fact, learned his elements of dueling from a tradition of similar duelists in his order, which I then tied in with the Renaissance campaign, because one of the player characters in that is himself a fencing duelist. And so the implication being that the traditions of dueling that he developed along with another NPC had fed in and established that that enemy character. And that's another great thing about doing interconnected historical campaigns, because you can create all these little things that tie in together and have massive ramifications.
That's incredible. We got a comment in the chat was, wait, did you make a game around the show Today's Special?
I'm afraid I don't know what that is.
Yeah, I'll have to look into that as well, because that's new to me. But Bomb Clancy, aka Mimic, seems to know what Today's Special is, so maybe we'll get an explanation of that. So you accomplished something in doing my research on you and learning more about you in preparation for the interview. You were able to take your love of TTRPGs and your love of vampires and incorporate that into a presentation you made at MIT during their BAHFest East 2018. And I'm going to put a link to this in the chat for anybody to check out. It'll also be in the description of the video. You were able to make a presentation about how big data will be able to help us hunt vampires. First off, how did this opportunity come about? And two, what was the motivation to make the topic about this specifically? And for those who don't know, if you could explain what BAHFest is, I found out through watching the video, but I'd be curious to pass that information along.
So BAHFest is the Festival of Bad Ad Hoc Hypotheses. Basically, it's coming up with terrible, nonsensical explanations for why things are the way they are. What the presentation I did actually broke two major rules of the BAHFest. One, that it's dealing with supernatural entities, and two, that it's a proposal for doing things rather than an explanation for how things are. But the people putting it on were sufficiently intrigued by my idea that they said, screw it, we'll allow it. The person who is mostly responsible for it actually tweeted at the time that the idea I proposed was in fact the most evil concept ever to be presented at BAHFest.
Well, and it was so well done because it was funny. Like, you did such a good job of making it humorous and throwing in a couple of laughs, but it was also horrifying because of how accurate and in some way haunting this fact is for the rest of us, let alone for the purposes of hunting down vampires, which I thought was so clever and such a nice spin on it that made it fun and accessible, but also extremely informative. What was kind of the where did you come up with this idea first off, like at all? And
So,
secondly, how did you twist it and incorporate it into doing this?
at the with the same group that first introduced me to 20th anniversary edition, the GM was running a hunter game, and so my hunter concept was, the computer guy, but rather than focusing on like hacking or the standard things that you'd expect, he was focusing on big data analysis, which is to say, looking at the huge wealth of data available in the panopticon that is our modern world and incorporating that into hunting down monsters. And so, as a fun little project, I thought of, well, how would you actually do this for mass identification of vampires? And I wrote out some of the details. For clarity, I was at the time getting a master's in informatics and the large scale analysis of social media and other systems for, the complete elimination of privacy and the massive surveillance states that uh, we are all collectively building.
Well, I've never seen it better presented as an argument for why the Camarilla believes the getting rid of technology and getting rid of not using cell phones, because it does give all of the foundational arguments for why you wouldn't want to do that if you were a vampire, why it would be very detrimental to vampires and honestly all supernaturals, because you make an excellent argument about werewolves as well in there. And I just think it was so well put together, so well presented. And the fact that you did it all in under 7 minutes, which is even more impressive. Because when I first got the video, I was like, okay, I'm settling in. I've got my food, I got my drink. We're going to hear like a 30-minute TED talk. And then I look at the video and it's 7 minutes long. And I'm like, what? How? But you cover all the very valid and relevant points. I loved the visuals you used. Like, I can't recommend this video high enough for anybody who is interested in starting a hunter campaign, but also just wants some insight into like some vampire reasoning as to why this should be avoided, because it was a perfectly laid out, almost second Inquisition argument as to
Which I
how
should point
easy.
out was before the Second Inquisition came out.
Yep, yeah. It's so well put together. So check out that link, everyone who's watching, and like I said, it'll be in the description of the video. It's a very quick watch, but it's extremely entertaining and informative, and I can't credit you enough for that. So I have received so many questions from the community that I want to take a moment to make sure to cover as many of those as possible, because people were very interested in your approach to storytelling in your choice of games. So I'm going to go over some of these really quickly. Werewolf, WHERE, from our community asks, for the historical campaigns, your choices of splat with time period look like such cool mixes. Do you have any really memorable emergent moments of this mixing of specific splats and settings that have stuck with you? Also, any Dream Chronicles you haven't had the chance to land yet?
So, one which definitely stuck with me was an innovation that one of my players made. This was in that same chronicle, which was set in the predominantly Jewish village in northern Italy. One of the player characters was playing a Tremere who acted as the rabbi for the village.
Okay.
So, after the marriage of the Baron with the Fey woman, a lot of the local children started showing strange abilities, like being able to read each other's thoughts, apparently. The Tremere naturally were extremely interested in this, and so asked their local agent to collect some blood from the local children. this was very difficult because the other player characters were not keen on allowing the Tremere access to the blood of their children. So the player, who I should point out is himself Jewish, and so has an understanding of these sorts of things, uh, came up with a creative solution, being the rabbi, of collecting the blood during the bris,
Oh,
which is to say the
no.
circumcision parts.
Oh my goodness.
Yes, so a memorable emergent topic.
That
We
is
still give that player both laud and hell for that creative decision to this day.
So Rebecca, aka Mimic, also asks, which splat do you think is easiest to mix in with historical elements? I'm sure that there's kind of a reasoning for all of them depending on the time period, but overall, based off of all of the different campaigns you've run and everything, which one did you find is easiest to slot in to different, you know, time periods or elements?
Well, any of the big three, mages, vampires, and werewolves, fit in almost anywhere and any time because there have always been predators feeding on humanity, and they can work just about anywhere. They definitely have rough patches after the First Inquisition gets going. Uh, Werewolves are deeply invested in all parts of human society, and in 20th anniversary and earlier at least have their bloodlines, which are they're invested in ensuring gained social clout or at least survival. And mages, humans have always had a tradition of engaging with the unknown. And I should point out that mages aren't just people who cast spells, they're also people who are incredibly good at science and technology.
Yeah.
So the Florence game is they're all part of what's called the Order of Reason, which is opposed to magic. They are working to create a world of science, logic, reason for the benefit of humanity. And so obviously, like the player character isn't like reading into the past and having post cognitive visions. No. Instead, he's doing deep analysis of what happened in the past and doing a Sherlock Holmes style reconstruction of it. And obviously, the player character who goes into the spirit realm isn't doing it through magic. No. He's doing it through alchemy, which he learned through werewolves, which is totally not magic. It's
It's
science.
not. It's science.
He's going into the spirit realm through science. So the meta joke of Mage, for those who aren't familiar with it, is that regardless of how you are doing your abilities, they use exactly the same mechanics, even if the characters consider them wildly different.
Oh, that's amazing. Mimic also asks, what determines which historical places or events you won't use, or are there events / historical events that are off limits? Is there anything you won't touch?
Generally, that's the sort of thing that comes out in session 0. As to things that we particularly want to avoid, we set up lines and veils. Do you guys use that in your
Yeah,
campaign?
absolutely. Safety tools
Yeah,
to the nth degree.
yeah, we do lines and veils in session 0s, as well as just the ability to stop play if people need it for any reason.
St. Petersburg by Night is brought to you through collaborations with our partnered vendors, Wolfpack Dice, Ember Fox Dice, Dragon Ink Dice, Bear the Bard, Champs Tramps, Penshi Artista, and Chromatic Creations. Links to our partnered vendors, as well as our Twitch and YouTube channels, can be found on our website, stpbynight.com. The official theme song for St. Petersburg by Night is Vampire by Faith and Failure. You could find them at faithandfailure.com. You can follow St. Pete by Night on all socials with the hashtag St. Pete by Night. If you wish to support our program, you can do so at coffee.com/StPeteByNight to help keep the stories rolling.
So generally, we avoid things that you would expect, like explicit sex scenes. Just ignore that sort of thing, as you might imagine. We also regularly don't fixate as much on uh, the brutality of things like slavery and bigotry. We still reference them, absolutely, and they play big parts in our games. But, I'm not going to be uttering slurs or anything during any of the
Right,
games.
right.
And we're not going to be like delving into, yeah, this is how he was horrifically tortured for doing this action.
Is there any time periods that you aren't interested in touching on, or you specifically as storyteller, not necessarily your players, but you are just like, I'm not, I'm not interested in doing a game in that or anything during that time period?
I suppose some of the ones that are more over described, like that have too many established canonical NPCs, like Rome, for example.
Okay.
It's just there's so many absurdly powerful NPCs, all with canonical fates written out. So there just isn't much that you can do unless you're willing to just completely screw with canon, which I'm fine with for the
Sure.
most part, but
Sure.
still, it feels a little overcrowded and the player characters' interactions wouldn't matter as much. But for the most part, I'm pretty flexible with what. Okay, there's actually one other thing in World of Darkness that I generally avoid, which is East Asia, because what World of Darkness did with East Asia is a
Oh,
mess.
yeah. Kindred of the East was.
I can understand what they were trying for. It's some interesting stuff, and I know some other game masters who really do enjoy it. But honestly, it's a lot, and it's messy, and there is a reason that in my Japan game, I took all of the nice established lore and then I put it in a box, threw it in the river, and just concluded, no, everything is related to the dream.
Okay. All right. I want to go back to Werewolf's question. I realized we didn't answer a question, but are there any Dream Chronicles you haven't had a chance to land yet? Anything that you or
Ooh.
concept settings, time periods that you really wanted to do or want to do that have not happened yet?
Okay, so this requires a bit of explanation as to how Mage works.
Absolutely.
So, Mage is built upon the idea of the consensus, which is what everyone considers to be possible. The there's a faction which starts out as the Order of Reason and will eventually become the Technocracy, which is working to standardize reality and make it in such a way that is based upon reason and order and is largely beneficial to humanity instead of the monsters that are preying upon it and ripping it apart, as well as mages which are doing their own thing. From the 90s, it looked like, when they were originally writing, it was inevitable that the world would be moving towards a science based order where everyone would agree about basic facts of reality. Education and the access to knowledge through the internet would ensure that ultimately science and materialism was triumphant and everything else was wiped out. That has not happened. We've basically seen a complete collapse of the consensus
Right.
in the past 10 years, if not earlier. We have flat earthers, we have anti vaxxers, no one can agree on basic realities of politics or history. We have all of these different bubbles, and there's incels, which basically are fit in really well with a particular wraith cult, like the black pilled people fit in as an oblivion cult so well, particularly the ones who are just overtly suicidal. A separate discussion. So trying to be part of the technocracy, like the sort of Men in Black style people who are trying to fit all of this together and figure out what went horrifically wrong. is the sort of campaign that I would be interested in one. Ironically, it's the one that's closest to the present, if not actually set in the present.
Is that part, like with all of the societal issues and the things you just mentioned, is that part of why you're not necessarily interested in running more modern games? Do you like to try and stay away from current politics and current, societal climate issues? Is it easier to just reflect on the past than it is to focus on the present? Because I do find that does create some interesting hindrances in newer games. Plus, with players, a wide variety of players, you have to be considerate of different political beliefs, different stuff like that. Is that a motivator for that?
Not as much as you think, actually.
Okay.
I'm actually pretty open about my politics with my players, and they're likewise fairly open as well. I mean, I make sure that any discussions about it remain civil. There are certain topics which players have not brought up, but which I would definitely set my foot down and say that no further discussion will happen on this. Fortunately, that has not come up.
Well, good, 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 good.
But not as much as you'd think. But I do find that if you are dealing with things in history, allows a certain amount of distance so that we can reflect on modern things without as much personal investment.
Okay, that makes sense. That makes sense. Actually, that is a great tail into the next question from Mimic as well, which is how do you balance historical accuracy with the supernatural elements of the world of darkness?
It's actually a lot easier than you'd think. Because all of the entities of the world of darkness have a vested interest in remaining secret, just say that they are behind the scenes, or alternatively, that the histories that we know might not be entirely accurate,
Yeah.
because there are many beings wildly capable of changing the perception of reality.
So you do have that almost written in ability to
Mhm.
change it however you see fit that's going to tailor to your story perfectly. I think also if you do enough of a deep dive into the lore and into the history from the world of darkness, they show you how. They do a very good job of incorporating, real life figures and supernatural or fictional characters from their world and showing the intertwined politics or the influences of the supernatural on those politics. And I think that you do enough reading of that, you almost gain an ability to come up with those situations yourself.
Yeah.
And like you said, you have the ability to just undo stuff if you need to, because there are creatures or figures capable of doing that to make entire
Yeah.
events erased or adjust them.
Or not necessarily make entire events erased, but change the recollections of it so that they are more in line with the history that we are more familiar with. So, what might have actually happened might be what the player characters were involved with.
Right.
But it was behind the scenes or has since been amended, generally because the player characters have done something wildly supernatural, and there are so many beings who would like to cover up any evidence of that.
Mimic also asks, how do you keep your players engaged and immersed in both the historical and supernatural aspects of your stories? Now, it sounds like you've got a pretty good group that's down for that sort of things, and obviously, when they're getting into it, they can pick from the chronicles that you list, especially newer players can look at it and say, okay, I am interested in this time period or I'm not, and they can decide based off of that. But what do you do to keep them? Because it is a lot of information, or it could be at least in certain circumstances. What do you do to keep them engaged with the material?
So a lot of what I do is I find like YouTube videos which will cover the time period, or fun pop articles, so that that's the initial engagement. For those who are interested in going deeper, I then provide more in-depth historical information, generally just various articles that I found online. Unfortunately, there's not a great way to just get the stuff from library books unless I screen or took pictures of it, but that's cumbersome.
Right.
But it also helps a lot that they're an inherently self-selecting group. The people who are willing and interested in playing historical games are the ones who sign up.
Do you do anything special or use any tools to try and help people get into the mindset of a time period? Like, do you play certain music or do you use certain visuals? Like, I know some people will dress in costume to try and represent the time period. Do you do anything like that in your storytelling?
I I I don't dress up. I'll
Fair.
say that. One of the things that I, as a GM, will frequently do is play music as I am prepping the game, which I think is particularly fitting with either the setting as a whole or with that particular session, which is.
Okay.
And what I'll then do is I will post that music to a particular channel of my Discord before the session, which is, by the way, a fantastic way to freak the players out with foreshadowing and
Yeah.
to have them guessing as to wait, what does this piece of music mean? Ideally, it's music from the era, or adaptations of it. Like bardcore music is pretty good for at least getting to like Hildegard von Blingen does adaptations of modern music in historical
Yes.
styles, and so that's a pretty good way to do it. I mean, obviously, it's not entirely accurate, but it's pretty good for that. If I'm going with a 1920s game or a 1980s game, there's so much music to select from.
Oh, for sure.
But I was doing the game set in Leningrad during World War II. There is fantastic communist propaganda music.
Yeah. Well, and
Yeah.
that's why the internet is so useful too, because we have better access to that kind of stuff than ever before.
Yeah.
And it does allow those as very useful tools. I ran a werewolf game set in 2013, which is the prequel to our current airing werewolf campaign. And I chose just songs from 2013, and at the beginning of every session, we would play a song from the era, and sometimes I would slip in a song that was a little foreshadowing, but usually it was just like this was a popular hit of 2013 to get people back into like, oh my god, that was 11 years ago or whatever the case may be. And it definitely had a payoff in the long run, and that was very cool. uh Zelios from the chat asked, what would you think about doing a historical conspiracy podcast to commemorate the end of one of your historical games?
So a lot of my players actually have approached me about doing a podcast, like running a World of Darkness podcast. The issue with that would be that many of my players have not signed up to be a podcast.
Right.
They have signed up and are paying for where they can be relatively free and open and do horrific things, which they probably would not want to be publicized.
That's fair. That's a very
Like
valid
the
point.
the player who did the Brisk, for example, might not that mentioned to the rest of his
Or
community,
not want
even
their
if we.
face or name associated with it in any
Yeah,
capacity. Right.
even if it was fantastic. And my players have committed horrific atrocities in many of their games. And don't get me wrong, I absolutely make sure the players are aware of the
Right.
horrible things that they're doing. That's how
Right.
I personally work in personal horror. Just really emphasizing to them, okay, so for clarity, this is what you are doing, correct?
Yeah. Yeah.
And generally they will swallow and go through with it anyways.
Do it anyway. Just go for it. Well, and there's a lot of work that goes into production alone, and I can say that even producing a show like this, let alone the streams we have on the channel. So I'm sure that's just like extra effort that could be being put into making sure that the paying players are getting a better experience. But maybe it's something to consider, because I know just based off this conversation alone and the amount of questions we received, there are a lot of people who are fascinated by this approach to gaming, which is why I encourage people to go sign up for a game of Gregory's. I think it's a fantastic opportunity over at startplaying.games. Just sign up, get involved in one of these yourself, because it is a really, really cool opportunity for you to get involved in this. Another question comes from one of our community members, Great Man, who asks, what era/place interests you the most when it comes to running World of Darkness games? You've talked about a lot of them, but what is like your bread and butter, your favorite time period that maybe you've done the most effort of researching, or maybe that you've run the most chronicles in, or stories in? What is your go-to?
Well, favorite is just about impossible to say, but I can say that
Always,
there are
always.
two that we have come back to. One was the that we are just now starting up again was the game set in Baghdad during the Islamic Golden Age, the start of it. So that's eight. Well, the initial one was 825 AD, and we started out with that. The player characters were, a new pack dealing with all of the politics of a sept in Baghdad, which is extensive because there's a lot of lupus versus Hamid things going on. That's wolf-born versus human-born. Uh, and had a lot of fun. The player characters ended up starting a massive civil war and wiping out one of the groups of werewolves. So then we came back to that. We did a time skip of 15 years, in between which we did the Were Sharks of the Caribbean game. And the player characters were dealing with succession crises and ended up starting another civil war through
Okay.
all of their
Okay. Yep.
manipulation.
Why not?
And then we switched over to the Appalachian game, but players were so interested in the Baghdad game that we are now going back to it with a new pack.
Interesting.
So
Okay.
starting out 6 months before the second civil war that they start, so the player characters can get themselves established. Another setting that we're going back to. So my first big campaign on the site was set during the latter part of Christianization of Scandinavia. So after all of the missionaries had come in and had largely adjusted, had largely converted at least the rulers and a lot of the cities. So that was, of course, called the Twilight of the Vikings because I had to get a Twilight reference in there.
Why not?
Uh, so one of the player characters was interested because he himself had been a vampire who was in torpor for a few hundred years, woke up to it, Scandinavia. He did not like it all. And so he was interested in sort of turning back the clock on that using a legendary artifact known as the Spindle of the Norns, but that's a whole other complicated thing. Suffice to say, there was a bit of time travel, but ended up being self-correcting. Uh, but some of the players have been interested in doing a separate game there set earlier in the timeline. So that's where we can do the classic Viking ratings, which I
Sure.
mentioned. But it occurs to me now that we actually also did a separate mage game there set in the 1400s, which funnily enough, was like one of the player characters was a Christian missionary coming to this isolated village. The thing is, though, he was borderline heretical amongst the Christians because he was much more interested in like interfaith dialogue and all this other wild stuff,
Yeah.
and uh, ultimately ended up being harmonious with everyone and sharing compassion and personal accountability with the local mages. It actually ended up being the most optimistic and wildly successful player characters in any of the campaigns that I've been in.
So one of the issues that I have found trying to run historical games or games, located in different countries, different places, is that players will sometimes tend to create caricatures rather than characters. It'll be very stereotypical in the way they do their portrayal or very kind of over the top and not really get the nuance or get the subtleties or anything like that. Do you find that to be a problem in the types of games you run, and how do you deal with that? How do you, do you just let them do it because, hey, if it's fun, they're having fun? Or do you try to educate and tailor it to be less cartoony or less, stereotypical and more accurate to some degree?
I've seen that with a few of like the newer players who have come to me, but I generally point them towards resources or just during campaigns provide suggestions of, hey, have you considered this particular framing or this other thing which adds additional context and nuance? And honestly, they shape up pretty quickly and just develop a better depth to their character. Uh, so yeah, I'm not a fan of caricatures. I'm not a fan of the simplified view of history where everything fits out neatly and forgets that the people you are interacting with are, actual real people with their own flaws and foibles and also redeeming qualities.
Well,
You
yeah,
know,
and you put so much effort into the research, into presenting, an accurate or semi-accurate model of the situation. I'm sure that there is a certain pride that you take into the fact that you do try to make it as accurate as possible, or at least as respectful as possible. That's got to shine off on your players as well. It's like you're presenting all this information. It's got to educate them to a certain degree, to the
yeah,
point that they're going to stop being so cartoony or
there have been
stereotypical.
a few players that worried me with some of their enthusiasm for exploring particular parts of the game. So, for example, one of the player characters who fortunately did not stick with my campaign at the start of the Lombardy campaign was a little too excited at the prospect of creating Jewish stereotypes of blood libel. I'm glad that player didn't stick around because we would have had to have some very harsh conversations
For sure.
very early on.
For sure.
But the backstory that that character created, or that the player created for his character, ended up being the foundation for the first adventure. So it worked out.
Yeah, all right. Mimic asks in the chat, are there certain homebrew rules you use or character creation guidelines as a result of things being time-based and where they fall canonically with World of Darkness?
So for the falling canonically timeline wise, I generally think of like what tribes or clans are actually plausibly available in the
Right.
region. If it doesn't make sense for the character to be there, you better come up with a very good explanation as to why they're there.
Right.
Like for a setting like Baghdad, which was like the center of trade for the entirety of the Silk Road, it's plausible to have just about any old world werewolf tribe. But it still wouldn't make a lot of sense to have, the any of the Native American tribes.
Right. So you do try to tailor it and make sure that the characters that are created for the setting would fit within that setting, that it's not just out of left field. You get a glass walker hanging out in the Middle East in a time period before glass walkers were even a thing.
Yeah, I mean, instead they would be the warders of men at the time,
Right.
which were very extensive and powerful in my take on Baghdad at the time, because there's basically no canonical stuff as to what's going on in Baghdad. I ended up having the House of Wisdom be a sept, the House of Wisdom being a massive translation house that existed and preserved a lot of the texts of the era. So that ended up being a cairn for werewolves because of the sheer amount of passion and knowledge that was going into it. The lupus, like the hardcore lupus, hated the fact that it worked at all, and that's sort of the core of the civil war that's been brewing.
Okay. Okay. So
Uh,
another
uh,
question.
oh,
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to make sure that I answered everything about the question because it
Yeah.
went off wildly on a tangent.
Yeah, oh, I think so. I think we covered it.
Okay.
Great Man asks, if you were given the chance to write for any splat, which one would you write for and what would you write?
Oof, that is a good question. So to write for it professionally, I assume you mean like if I had
Yeah, yeah, like if
sudden
you were given
control.
World of Darkness were to reach out to you and say, hey, we're looking to develop this element or this specific
I mean, I
setting,
would
which one?
love to be the one to fit Mage into fifth edition.
Oh, that's
That'd
a
be
headache
quite
I
an
can
undertaking.
imagine.
But
Well,
you know what? I'd be happy to give it a shot.
absolutely. That actually spins to another question, which was, if you could, if you got to choose which supernatural creature of the World of Darkness, vamp, were creature, mage, you became, what would you choose and why?
I mean, that's really dependent on the context. A vampire embraced as a shovelhead into the Sabbat is very different than one embraced by the Ventru. Similarly, a werewolf who is a Thetis of the Fianna is not nearly as great of a position as one who is just like a Hamid born into the Silver Fangs, and then mages are wildly different as well. Wraiths, you have to be dead. I think all things being equal, probably a vampire.
Okay.
Immortality is pretty awesome, and vampires have the most reliable way to get it. I know, tragedy, I can't ever see the sun again, and I must subsist on the blood of my fellow man or animals, but we're going to ignore that because it's not meant to be. But seriously, immortality is pretty awesome.
Yeah, being a night owl, I'm like, it wouldn't be too much of an
Yeah,
adjustment for me.
I'm
Like
totally a night owl myself too,
I'm
so
just
yeah.
like I'm up till sunrise anyway. Then I go to bed, so it's fine.
Yeah, I mean, I need to make some adjustments, obviously. Need to work
Dietary
out.
adjustments,
Yeah, need to work out a stable source of blood, but get hooked up with a blood bank or get some chickens or something, start a farm. You're great. And
That's
then, you can use the blood bond to ease over any sort of
yeah, any
social
social
problems you might
issues you
have.
might have. Yeah,
Yeah.
you could smooth over most of the problems you would encounter. That's one of the things that I always find interesting about like, oh, what fantasy world would you like to live in? I'm like, well, okay. Am I a normal commoner in Gondor during Lord of the Rings? Because if that's the case, no, I don't
No,
want to.
absolutely not. And definitely not in
Unless
like Game of Thrones. You do
no,
not want to
oh,
be a commoner in
absolutely
that.
not. Any
Yeah.
of these, like, unless you get to pick all of the elements as to why you're in that setting, there's
Yeah.
no way I'd want to be like just a regular, peon in Star Wars. Like,
Yeah.
no,
No.
you'd want to be the heroes, or you'd want to be, the villains, or whatever the case may be. But
For
that
being
that
a
was,
completely average person, the
yeah,
modern day isn't that bad. The modern
no,
day real world is all right.
no, it's absolutely, it's way, way, way better.
Don't
Uh,
get me wrong, it has its wild share of its own problems, its own terrors we are actively confronting, but
constantly. But
still better
overall,
than being a peasant.
yes. So Lolo Man 02 asks in the chat, what's your favorite version or interpretation of Gehenna?
Ah, I don't like any of them. Uh,
Well, if you had to
I,
create your own, then what would it be?
oh, now that's a tricky one. So, if we're dealing with just Gehenna of vampires, uh, ooh, let's see here. I mean, I do kind of like the whole humankind irrevocably discovers vampires, suddenly engage in this new world, whether it's as relatively rosy as, what's the show? True Blood, or considerably darker examples of vampires being hunted down, or vampires just outright ruling society. That sort of confrontation, I think, really would bring in a lot of confrontation of how vampires do actually relate to their humanity in ways that, oh, yeah, the elder vampire suddenly rises up and mind controls everyone, or God comes back and judges you, doesn't.
Yeah.
Because I find that okay, I should preface this as saying that I absolutely love the mysticism of World of Darkness.
Hmm.
My entire Egypt game that I'm running is deeply invested in things like why the Setites have snake powers, despite the fact that Set is not associated with snakes at all. That's a key thing that's developing because in 600 BC, when I'm starting, uh, most Setites have Protean instead of Serpentis.
Right.
And so the change is what's actively occurring in the campaign. But that's a separate story. And I also love, interacting with weird stuff and gods. But vampires are distinct from the other splats in that they are fundamentally tied with humanity, that they are dependent upon humanity for their continued existence, and they are built around tying themselves into social structures. And they're also fundamentally built upon the lie that they are not what they appear to be. So the question of what happens if you completely strip away that lie, of what happens if the reality is available to all, that there are blood-sucking parasites amongst them who were once living human, and what do you do with that reality, seems to me like it's much more thematically interesting than tacking on, oh, then a god shows up.
Right. I think one of the best interpretations I've seen of Gehenna so far was the Week of Nightmares. The way they played that out as a world event that it,
Mhm.
impacted all of the splats, how the
Mhm.
technocracy got involved, how the werewolves were affected, how, the Ravnos were all but eradicated. Like I
Mhm.
loved the idea that they didn't make it just a vampire thing. They didn't make it
Mhm.
just a specific localized thing. Like they did give it world impacting consequences. And I really hope that in the direction they're going with fifth edition and hopefully 20th and anniversary as well, is that they don't lose that element of it. Because one thing I
Mhm.
hate in superhero movies is I'm like, if there's a world ending event, why is only Thor showing up?
Right.
Why wouldn't Iron Man also be there and all these other people? Like, why would it just be so localized? And World of Darkness does a pretty good job, like with War of Chicago, how the werewolves and the vampires intersected, and like obviously Week of Nightmares. I think that's something that they should keep up with, and I hope that they do give us more opportunities for that going forward in the future. But I did like that Gehenna interpretation of, you know, Week of Nightmares was a perfect example of like if an antediluvian is woken up or they get up for some reason, this is going to be the impact it has. We got to see that in I guess, a microcosm, even though it was
Yeah.
pretty huge. Like it
Yeah.
did show it
Oh,
in a
absolutely. I completely agree. If I hadn't actually thought about that as a Gehenna scenario because it doesn't actually, end the world. But I do think that that really is fun, and it really shows how everything fits together, and it develops all of the different themes of all the different settings in new ways. So, for example, it shows that the technocracy, which was previously presented almost entirely as an antagonistic force,
yep.
is actually pretty critical to the survival of humanity.
Yeah.
It ended up altering Wraith in ways that created a fun post-apocalyptic afterlife, as well as providing the impetus for waking up demons and freeing them from the abyss.
Yeah, absolutely. So I love that, and I hope that's something that's not lost as the meta story or the meta plot of the game continues forward. Like I really do hope that they have that element and incorporation because I remember they did used to run events where you could impact the world setting at certain cons, like they'd run a specific story element and that you could do that. I'd love to see it get to that level again, just because that was the heyday of World of Darkness. Like that was when they were at their prime, and obviously since then they've gone through some changes and stuff has happened, but it would be nice to see that kind of world vested interest in meta story and in meta plot. I've always enjoyed that.
I have kind of mixed feelings about that, actually. The
Okay.
idea that, yes, big characters that you aren't involved with have changed the setting dramatically, and you and your group now have to deal with that because you're not really that important. You might be involved in your little local politics, but it doesn't actually affect the big picture. I
Fair.
think that was one of my big issues with early World of Darkness. And especially in any of the written modules that they have, because most of their pre-written modules are cool NPCs do awesome things, and the player characters get the joy of watching them be
Yeah.
awesome and can in no way affect the outcome.
Yeah. I think it'd be cool to have some way to write a story where it's because of the PCs the
Mhm.
NPC does the thing. So one of the my go-to examples of why haven't we received a book or any material about this is the assassination of Hardestat. Uh, like they talk about it happening. They talk about, and this is a fifth edition thing. I don't know if they mention it in 20th
I'm afraid
anniversary.
no, I'm not familiar with that
But
part.
yeah, in fifth edition, they talk about a conclave in Vienna where Theo Bell kills Hardestat, which causes the Bruja to go anarch as a whole clan.
That's right. Yes, I
Uh,
recall that part.
they bring up this whole thing, and I'm like, well, why isn't that a story? And why don't we have more details on it? Like that in itself could be an adventure where the PCs either try to prevent it or try to cause it and gives them some stakes and input in it. Because you're right, like a lot of the times, a lot of the big events were like, oh, Beckett goes and does XYZ,
Isn't he
Theo
cool?
Bell. Yeah, exactly. And you don't really get any involvement in that. You don't get any connection to that. It's just, hey, we've shifted the world because we decided to have one of our NPCs do something major. Um, but yeah, I think it would be very, very cool for a way to find a blend between that of like, okay, we've created an adventure or a story or a chronicle or whatever based around an important historical event in the world of darkness. Here's how your characters can play into it, or
Yeah.
here's how you can involve them. I think would be a very, very interesting thing. So I've got a whole bunch of questions left. I'm going to try to rattle off them. But this is such a great conversation. I can't help but getting sidetracked. But
Of course.
okay.
I was just about to mention how that ties into Chronicles of Darkness
Yeah.
stuff and how they basically went the other direction. But yes, you only have so much time for this interview.
Yeah, absolutely. So what do you think is the most underrated splat?
Oh, uh, hmm. Changeling. Gonna go with that. I'm gonna go with Changeling, the Dreaming Changeling. It got. uh, It was very different tonally from it, as we've discussed earlier, but I think it has a lot of fun potential.
I'm glad to see that there is a fan base of Changeling. Like
It's
I
one of the
never
ones that
got
they
into it.
re-released in 20th anniversary edition.
Yeah, I never got into it, but I see people wanting Changeling next, which I was surprised by. Like, because I thought Mage is for sure what's next. Fifth edition again. Apologies for that, but like of the
Yeah,
splats people are asking for, I'm like, what? Like, what do you want to see? A lot of people want Changeling, and I'm really impressed by and surprised by that because I always did think Changeling was kind of the stepchild of like the world of darkness and was an underrated one. I also think Wraith is underrated. I love Wraith.
oh, it's grim though.
It's so grim, but again,
I mean, if
goth
your if
kid
your
growing up,
gothy heart
so
is beating for it, then yes.
it is. It is. Uh, what do you think is the most overrated splat?
Oh, and they all have their merits. I can tell you one splat which I really don't like and which no one likes, which is Mummy. Uh,
I
but
hate
that doesn't
Mommy.
really answer the well. The problem is that it's so like there is so much contradiction between the different editions, and so it was absolutely nonsensical as to what's supposed to actually be happening. I ended up just having to say in my Egypt campaign of all things, no, mummies don't exist. Ignore all of that. And if there was any campaign which would have been perfect for mummies, it was one set in
It
Egypt.
was one set in Egypt, absolutely. But yeah, just mummies. And I'm surprised
They
that
did a lot better of that actually in Chronicles of Darkness.
a
They
lot of splats they did better in Chronicles. I think like
yeah,
Demon also was a terrible thing they introduced in Old World of Darkness that was
I
not
actually
good.
liked Demon into Old
The
World.
old
I
one,
should say
really?
I like Dark Ages Demon.
Okay, well
The
that's different.
modern one
That's
I haven't
different.
done a game with.
Yeah, the modern one when they introduced that, I was like, ah, it's over. Like Old World of
No.
Darkness as we know it is over.
Yeah, but Chronicles, their take on Demon was fantastic. Honestly, in general, they were better the further they get away from the source material. Beast, I thought was fantastic. Um, the base concepts were fantastic, but then it got controversial, both because of its writer and also because it really tried to overly tie in a particular moral angle. We're getting way off topic. We have
absolutely.
questions to get
No,
to.
that's totally fine. What's your favorite historical fact? Just in general. It doesn't have to be World
Oh
of Darkness
man.
related, but like you've done so much
Oh,
historical deep diving and different time periods analysis. What's your favorite or some favorites? I won't even limit you to one.
okay. So I suppose one of the big things that I've really discovered over the course of this, and that my players are always interested in, is how wildly religions have changed over the course of eras. So, for example, starting like in the era in which we're playing in Baghdad, uh, wine was largely considered a personal choice amongst Muslims at the time. Like there were some sects who were opposed to it, but it wasn't nearly as forbidden as now. Women's rights was vastly improved compared to previous eras and arguably more progressive then than it is now in many of these countries. Similarly, Christianity and its attitudes towards non-Christian religions has wildly changed considerably.
Hmm.
Starting off with the earlier ones, they were very conciliatory and much more willing to syncretize and blend religions. But then once they started becoming completely dominant in an area, then they became more doctrinaire and insistent on enforcing particular things. And then also just the bits and pieces they pick up from various local religions are always fun.
Absolutely. And when you intermix politics and
Yeah,
wealth and power into things, that's going to
right. But
change the
also,
shape of stuff too.
contrastingly, for many of my players, how various religious institutions have done a lot of positive good things that
Hmm.
like atheists today wouldn't give them credit for, like storing of a lot of records and bringing in new traditions which were wildly beneficial to local populations. Like in many cases they were bringing in more feminist ideals than existed previously.
Yeah.
That's not at all consistent, though, because the local beliefs varied wildly. But it's not just the oh yeah, organized religion is all bad, and what it had previously was terrible. Nor is it that the organized religion is the universal bastion of freedom and happiness and wonder. Like in the Florence game, we're dealing with the Pope waging war on Florence after attempting to assassinate the members of the Medici family, and the player characters are very involved in the Medici. One of them is, in fact, the illegitimate bastard of one of the Medici who was assassinated. So, and the all the considerations of what it means for your religion when the head of your religion is actively waging war on you, because so he ended up excommunicating all of Florence, and the Florentine clergy stuck with Florence and counter excommunicated him. So
Amazing.
yeah, religion is wild, and in
It's
no
so
way is it.
wild. It
Yeah,
was one of
it's
my
in no
favorite
way.
courses in college was studying
Yeah.
religion. Just yeah,
Mm.
it's so interesting.
So delving
I
into that is always fun. Yeah.
I think we have or had one of your players in the chat. It was me X all along asks, just managed to slide in. Glad to see you out here, Greg. Much love from the Baroness. How do you so confidently and deftly adapt to the wild shenanigans of players and keep it cohesive?
Improv. The
That's
magic of improv. Uh, Shout out to X, one of my longest serving players who's been playing with me for ever since the original Scandinavia campaign. Always livens things up.
amazing. Lolo Man also asks how you would go about it if one of your players was aiming for Golconda or another very out there path across a long chronicle.
I mean, I think that that would be fantastic. The tricky part would be figuring out how that fits with the other player characters. We'd probably want to work out in a session zero whether that's the sort of direction that you'd like to consider, because inherently that's contradictory with dealing with a lot of the intrigues that vampires do with. I would be totally fine with that inherently. We just need to make sure that it fits into the chronicle as desired.
Absolutely. Have you ever participated in LARP, and what are your thoughts of LARP as a whole?
I have not, and I respect those who enjoy it.
Because, yeah, there was a question from Zelios who said, thoughts on By Night Studios doing large scale LARP events in destination cities?
Several of my players enjoy those, actually.
Yeah.
Uh, so, all for them. But it's a lot of dressing up and travel for me that I am not capable of indulging in.
Going places, being in contact with other human beings in a post-pandemic world. Yeah, I
Yes.
totally get it.
Yeah.
I know that By Night Studios just had an event in Chicago. I know that Jason Carl was there. Like there was a lot of incorporation there. So obviously there's an appeal to it, and I think it is an excellent opportunity if LARP is your thing. I think everybody should try it at one point or another, just because it is a whole new way of gaming. But it can also be very overwhelming for those who are particularly sensitive to being around a lot of individuals at one time. But that is very, very cool. Then let me see if I can find one more question to ask you, and then we can wrap this up. Uh, Outside of the World of Darkness, what are your favorite TTRPGs?
Ooh, Fate's pretty good. For just the general flexibility and narrative uh, uh, potential that the players have. I really enjoyed a lot of the Forged in the Dark games. Like, I ran a Scum and Villainy campaign. And let's see here. Savage Worlds is fun for just quick, pulpy stuff. Uh, well, I could go on
Yeah,
extensively for the different ones. So many
both.
RPGs have so many applications.
That's fair. I love the Powered by the Apocalypse system, so you're like Monster of the Week or anything like that. It's very
I
simple
tried that. I haven't
mechanics.
gotten. I feel like didn't quite grasp the system when I was trying to run it. I've been trying to play in a game to see how somebody does it, but I have not had the chance to do that yet because I really want to try it. But
So my last question, coming from me, as a professional storyteller, what advice would you give to somebody who is just starting out storytelling or wanting to get involved in storytelling? Like, how can they get better doing storytelling as a craft or in their approach to storytelling? Because we've got a lot of people on our server, as well as just across the community as a whole, that are either too intimidated to try it or are overwhelmed at it, or are trying it but are a little bit, struggling to find their footing. What is some advice you would give to them?
all right. Well, for those who are hesitant about it, i- it's really not that hard. It is a skill which you build up over time, of course. It requires practice, but it's not magical. It's not something that, only elect people are capable of
For
accomplishing.
sure.
You just have to find a group who's willing to be flexible with you and willing to, try your first campaign and knows that it's your first campaign, is willing to help you out and just go for it. Your first campaign will probably be okay. Uh, it might not be the campaign that you remember forever, but you'll build your way up to that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think being transparent with your players is important. Just saying, hey, this is my first go. If you got a good group of players, they'll go for the ride with you. Also, go with what you know. Start with
Yeah.
something familiar, local, use places you know, places you've been, even if it's small town USA or if you're in the middle of nowhere. Run something around there, just something that you feel comfortable with before expanding out. You don't have to do what our wonderful guest does and try to tackle huge scenarios. It can be
Yeah.
simple and straightforward stuff early
Yeah,
on.
my first World of Darkness game was set in my hometown.
Yep.
So, to start off simple and basic and things you're familiar with.
Yeah, and I think there's just
Yeah.
no better way than to just
Yeah.
do it. Just do
If you
it.
have
Get it
any
under your belt.
yeah, as for like general is storytelling questions, that's way too broad. But feel free to reach out to me either through the Discord here or through my start.playing. Just feel free to message me. I'm happy to offer advice for anything you're dealing with, whether that be general storytelling or how to do things historically or how to get started professionally. I'd be happy to provide people advice on that.
Yeah, wonderful. And Gregory, thank you so much for taking this time to join us to field all these wild, out of left field questions. There are so many
Oh,
stories to tell and so many more questions I have to ask. So we'll have to have you back at some point in the future for
I'd
another
love to.
conversation. Because,
Oh, and by the way, I do currently have like most of my campaigns are filled. I do have 2 slots left for Wednesday, or sorry, Thursday, which is the Egypt campaign, and then possibly 1 slot in my Friday Viking campaign coming up. So keep an eye out for those.
absolutely. And that being said, I want to promote Gregory Maus on Start Playing. It's startplaying.games/GM/GMoss. You can sign up for games there. You can get in contact. You can just do all the wonderful things that Start Playing allows you to do. There are a lot of gaming opportunities. And even if you can't do one soon, just keep an eye on the site, bookmark it, do what you have to do, go back because new opportunities are presenting themselves all the time. And if this conversation is any indication, you're in for a treat of a game It just sounds like it's going to be so much fun, no matter what time period, no matter what splat. You're going to enjoy it, and you will learn about 20th Anniversary Edition, or Advanced World of Darkness, as I like to call it. But with the base learning you have for 5th edition, you will be well suited and well on your way to expand to the 20th anniversary setting. Again, Gregory, thank you so much for taking the time. It really, really does mean a lot to me and to the community, and you have been an absolutely wonderful, wonderful guest for us here tonight, and we can't thank you so much. Is there anything else you'd like to plug coming up? Anything people can look out for? Anything else you want to say before we sign off for the night?
No, that's pretty much it. But thank you so much. It's been an absolute delight. If you would like to talk about further things, I'd be happy to do so at a future date.
We definitely will. So go follow Gregory on Start Playing, and go follow St. Pete by Night on all that social media you see listed down below. I know we had a lot of new follows and new viewers tonight because of this wonderful interview. So go give us a follow. You can join our Discord server in the links down below. You can follow all our social media. And stay tuned. This week we've got a lot of content coming your way. On tomorrow night, we've got the next episode of Bloody Strings, which is our Vampire the Masquerade Chronicle, or one of them, I should say. We've got Rage Across Tampa, our Werewolf the Apocalypse Chronicle on Tuesday. On Thursday, we have Don't Get Caught. And next Saturday, we will be back here talking to another storyteller, DM Disaster. So you can tune into that next Saturday, same time, 9 p.m. Eastern, here on Twitch. But for Gregory, I'm Kent. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful evening, everyone. Good night.
This has been a St. Petersburg by Night production. After Dark is produced in agreement with the World of Darkness and Dark Pact. The host for After Dark is Kent. Visit our website at stpbynight.com for more information about all of our productions and how you can become part of our community. Thank you for listening. Until next time, fangs, stakes, and claws out.